One second, one
Hopefully,
second. Now,
yeah, I see it's live. I want to welcome everybody in our audience and our speakers to our online panel on Islamophobia and Jewish-Muslim relations. My name is Richard Silverstein, and I'm delighted to have some very distinguished panelists joining us to talk about this. And I want to just do some housekeeping up front and say that our four speakers will speak for about 8 minutes each after I introduce them. And after they finish, the four of us speaking, we'll have some back and forth, hopefully some time for the four of us to talk about what we said. And then we will try to take some questions that our audience can put into the chat on their live stream. So I'd like to begin by introducing our panel. Our first speaker is going to be Dr. Hatem Bazian. You can see his name on the screen. He's the co-founder and professor of Islamic law and theology at Zaytuna College, and he lectures in the departments of Near Eastern and Asian American and Asian Diaspora Studies at UC Berkeley. Our second speaker will be Donna Neville, a community psychologist and educator, co-director of Parseo, an education and research center, and she was the co-founder of Jews Against Anti-Muslim Racism and Jews for Racial and Economic Justice. Our third speaker will be Zahro Billoo, who is the director of the CAIR Bay Area chapter. CAIR is the Council on American Islamic Relations. And I will speak last, and I write the Tikun Olam blog, and I am a freelance journalist. So I'd like to call to the stage, so to speak, Hatem Bazian, and he will speak about Islamophobia in a general sort of global and domestic context.
good afternoon, and thank you, Richard, for the introduction. And it's good to see Zahra and Donna with us in this panel. So let me jump in 8 minutes to try to get as much material out as possible. Islamophobia is a global phenomenon, and it touches different zones and different areas. So we have North America and part of the English-speaking world. That is one zone where securitization, monitoring, and intrusion in Muslim affairs occurs. You have the French-speaking zone, Quebec, France, and some of the Francophone areas where intrusion on the body space and religious sites of Muslims to regulate and control what can take place. So today, France have instituted what we call a board to govern over Muslim institutions. So in France today, we have Mufti Macron, who actually is the one that dispenses with all of the guidance for what it is to be a Muslim in France. Then we have the social media space, which is also distinctively another zone, transnational, immediate, and used both to monetize for electoral politics, but also as a site of instigating violence. And we could speak a lot about it further. Then you have the Muslim majority states Islamophobia, where contestation of what's a good Muslim, bad Muslim, what is state-crafted Islam versus Islam that is to be targeted. We see that in Egypt and other places where the discourse around Muslimness in a Muslim majority state. And then we have the genocide zone, where Muslims are subject to genocide, whether we're talking about Myanmar, Rohingya, talk about the Uyghur in China, Muslims in India, Kashmir, and also Palestine. So that's a distinctive zone. When we speak about this genocidal zone, in terms of the Palestine-Israel conflict, Israel began to dabble in Islamophobia for quite a long time. You could actually trace some of the pro-Israel and Israeli organizations in Israel, and then the pro-Israel organization here, whether it's the aspect of the mainstream Jewish organizations or those who are aligned even with segments of the Christian coalition. Islamophobia becomes the go-to arena beginning in the 1990s as the Soviet Union collapsed and the end of the Cold War. The new menace, quote, was crafted around Islam and Muslim. And this is where we say the red threat was transformed into the green threat. And in this sense, becomes many of those who speak about Islam and Muslims begin to utilize the same type of civilizational discourse, Islamophobic discourse, otherization discourse toward Muslims, and then pushing that Israel is the key strategic ally in the fight against the rise of so-called Islamic threat. This intensifies and gets further post 9/11, where you have the Frank Luntz report that begins to say, for those who want to speak about Israel in the Western world, in particular in the United States, need to mimic or to, in essence, translate their language into the language of terrorism and to the language of common threat. And I think in this one, the pro-Israel forces, the pro-Israel speakers and institutions were very successful in actually riding the terrorism, the war on terrorism landscape to centralize Israel as the go-to ally. And in this sense, many of the spokespeople and organizations within the mainstream Jewish community began to reflect that type of language. And I would say in here, in particular, the AJC, the American Jewish Congress, was very clear in terms of this discourse with David Harris, never missing an opportunity to use Islamophobia in his radio spots that were being broadcast nationally, constantly problematizing Islam and Muslims. The ADL began to also amplify this anti-Muslim discourse in their language and their speeches, and also at the local level, JCRC, Jewish Community Relations Councils, also likewise beginning to amplify this type of discourse relative to Islam and Muslim threat. Now, later on, again, I was beginning to write about this for quite some time. We've actually, from 990 return, we actually found out that also some of the major Jewish federations were actually funding some of the Islamophobic groups and some of the Islamic organizations. And just to find out that San Francisco Jewish Federation was providing funding for Gerd Wilder, a very pernicious character, one of the preeminent Islamophobes in the country, and then further also providing funding for some of the organizations that target pro-Palestine and also Muslim groups. And I think if you trace some of that funding, including Tea Party activists, Camera and Canary Mission and others, begin to be at the hub of Islamophobia and demonization of the Muslim subject. Lastly, in terms of just being aware of time, I actually say the following, that some of the prominent mainstream Jewish organizations, in particular AJC and ADL, are responsible for mainstreaming and giving a respectability stage for Islamophobia, in the sense of using their platform, national platform, to highlight and give standing for the most pernicious Islamophobic figures. Stephen Emerson, Daniel Pipes, and even also individuals who can be seen as Muslim, but themselves say that they have really left Islam, Ayan Hirsi Ali, and giving her the Courage Award at a time where Muslims actually were under duress and facing the national campaign of demonization. We would have expected and a commitment for anti-racism discourse to actually not to give the Courage Award to a person that have aligned themselves with the neoconservatives, somebody that aligned themselves with war and destruction in the Muslim world. Yet we find the priority in here protecting Israel by demonizing Muslims in the United States took priority. and as such, this type of mainstreaming and giving a stage to Islamophobes had far-reaching consequences. Now, we could see some of the most prominent figures that are at the hub of the Islamophobia industry. Daniel Pipes from Middle East Forum, Stephen Emerson, which we recently have found that he has actually have a direct line to the Israeli Prime Minister, the Israeli Prime Minister's office, asking Stephen Emerson to investigate and find out if Students for Justice in Palestine, an organization that I created here at UC Berkeley, if it actually is connected or received funding from Hamas. Stephen Emerson, for all intents and purposes, should be actually investigated and looked upon as an agent of a foreign country, state having that direct communication. Then you speak about Frank Gaffney, David Horowitz. All these are at the forefront. And then I don't want to leave Pamela Geller, where her bus ads across the country in San Francisco, New York, and other places. So mainstreaming Islamophobia, I would put it at the footprint and at the doorstep of some of the pro-Israel mainstream Jewish organizations. But I don't want to leave it at this negative. I also want to say that, positively speaking, that some of the work of Jewish Voice for Peace, the Jewish anti-Zionist collective, Tikun, and other organizations have partnered with the Muslim community to actually make a link between the rising tide of anti-Semitism and the rising tide of Islamophobia, and understanding those relationships and not biting on defending Israel through Islamophobia or centering Islamophobia as part of this work. And I think it's very important for us to both critique the use of Islamophobia, but also speak about that there is an alliances that have been forged at this particular time to counter what is occurring. So thank you, and I'll turn it to Richard for the next person to present.
Thank you for that wide-ranging discussion, Hatem. And now I'd like to call upon Donna Neville, who will be talking about, in more depth, about the funding of Islamophobia through Jewish communal institutions and Jewish federations.
So thank you,
Donna.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me to join you today. To acknowledge the moment we're in, I'd like to express my strong solidarity with all those fighting occupation from Ukraine to Palestine. I speak to you from my perspective as a white Jewish American partner in this work, as someone concerned with anti-Muslim racism, and also concerned with the ways the communities I'm part of evaluate and or respond to Islamophobia. We know that some Jewish organizations have participated in furthering Islamophobia as part and parcel of their uncritical support for Israel, as Hatem spoke about the anti-Muslim, quote, clash of civilizations concept. Quote, Western civilization is locked in a never-ending battle with Islam as a result of fundamental cultural differences rather than material factors such as the legacy of neo-colonialism and imperialism serves as a framework for US and Israeli government policies. Other Hasbara propaganda campaigns disparage Muslims and Islam to justify Israeli policies that dehumanize Palestinians. While Islamophobia manifests itself, as we know, in so many virulent and dangerous ways, I want to talk for a bit about what's known as liberal Islamophobia, which, while perhaps not always as obvious, also manifests itself in a number of destructive ways within some Jewish spaces and organizations. With liberal Islamophobia, you may oppose some forms of Islamophobia, like Islamophobic hate speech, for example, but still support state-sanctioned policies and programs that target Muslims and those perceived to be Muslim. For example, this might include support for the US, quote, war on terror, which since 9/11 has targeted and demonized Muslim, Arab, and South Asian communities across the globe. Looking at liberal Islamophobia, a common framing is to divide Muslims into two categories, those who are considered to be, as you mentioned, Hatem, good Muslims versus bad Muslims. Islamophobic assumptions are at the heart of this paradigm, the good Muslim, bad Muslim paradigm, a term that was introduced by Mahmoud Mamdani, who explains that it rests on the premise that post 9/11, quote, unless proved to be good, every Muslim is presumed to be bad. All Muslims are now under an obligation to prove their credentials by joining in a war against, quote, bad Muslims, unquote. And this assumption extends to Arabs, who are often all conflated as being Muslims, and to those perceived to be Arab, Middle Eastern, or Muslims, such as South Asians. So what ends up happening? I'm going to speak for a minute specifically about how it plays out in Jewish communities that I'm familiar with, but it obviously has parallels more broadly than as well. Many Jewish and other groups will work only with Muslim or Arab American groups that do not or agree not to publicly criticize Israel policies, and they insist that these Muslim or Arab American groups explicitly and publicly denounce anti-Semitism, criteria that Christian groups, for example, that are potential partners are never asked to meet. Also, many Jewish groups will only work with Muslim and Arab American organizations that publicly dissociate themselves from any Muslim or Arab groups or individuals that have been accused of supporting pro-Palestine groups or have any alleged connections to Hamas or to, quote, terrorism. And having evidence, by the way, is not required. What this does is it tries to control which Muslims and Arab Americans are considered suitable to work with while discrediting all others. This kind of scrutiny is based on lies and half-truths and distortions that are put forth by those who are promoting Islamophobia and anti-Arab racism, and sometimes by those who don't examine how this litmus test that they use contributes to Islamophobia and anti-Arab racism. And while we often hear so many public pronouncements made about the importance of working in coalition with Arab and Muslim Americans and how important interfaith work is, that commitment is often compromised by this good Muslim, bad Muslim paradigm, which makes it impossible to engage in work together that's rooted in true respect and integrity. So I think it's both important to understand how this paradigm plays out and to address it directly, and further to understand how it's often orchestrated by those who intentionally conflate criticism of Israel or anti-Zionism and the struggle for Palestinian justice with patently false accusations of anti-Semitism. I'd like to use my remaining few minutes to focus on a couple of concrete examples of Islamophobia that were challenging within Jewish communities. We know, as Richard and Hatem mentioned, that some Jewish organizations are funding some of the most virulent Islamophobic groups in the country. In recent years, progressive Jewish groups, including Jews Against Anti-Muslim Racism, Jews Say No, and Jewish Voice for Peace, released a very extensive report detailing how the Jewish Communal Fund of New York is supporting some of the worst purveyors of anti-Muslim hate. Some of the names that you mentioned, Hatem, the David Horowitz Freedom Center, the American Freedom Defense Initiative, whose public face is Pamela Geller, infamous for placing vitriolic anti-Muslim ads in public subways and buses. All of these JCF-funded groups are leaders or significant contributors to the Islamophobic network in America. The JCF has responded to this report and called to stop funding anti-Muslim hate with dead silence. While the JCF may claim it doesn't support these groups who simply, and that their donors simply fund groups with a range of politics, there is absolutely no doubt that they would not accept money from virulently anti-Semitic groups, nor should they. It should be no different for anti-Muslim groups. My second example, which you also spoke about, Hatem, is the Anti-Defamation League, which bills itself as committed to combating all forms of hate. While the ADL has certainly done some work to challenge Islamophobia, it has done a great deal of harm, a tremendous deal of harm in promoting it. The organization has engaged in illegal spying beginning in the 1950s on Arab Americans and progressive groups, which perhaps is why it never spoke up in all the years when the New York Police Department engaged in discriminatory surveillance of Muslim citizens. The ADL has given awards to the commanding officer of the New York NYPD Intelligence Division that had been implementing the surveillance program. They have a long history of labeling Muslim community groups as, quote, terrorist. Over 200 organizations, social justice organizations across the country, have signed a letter saying that the ADL is not a friend to social justice movements and asking organizations to reconsider them as a partner in social justice work. You can read the primer at droptheadl.org, droptheadl.org, that describes its history and ongoing pattern of attacking social justice movements led by communities of color, queer people, immigrants, Muslim Arabs, and other marginalized groups, while aligning itself closely with police, right-wing leaders, and perpetrators of state violence. For Jewish communities to be true and principled partners with Muslim communities, we need to be vigilant about standing in full solidarity with Muslim communities and opposing all forms of anti-Muslim racism, from acts of hate to state-sanctioned Islamophobia and policies that target Muslim communities here in the US and across the globe. Thank you.
Thank you, Donna. That was great speech, a great talk. I mean, and now I'd like to move to Zahro Billoo, who's the director of CAIR in the San Francisco Bay Area, to speak about her work and CAIR's work in fighting Islamophobia here in the U.S. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Richard, and good to hear from you and Dr. Hatem and Donna. I think it's our first event together, but I'm a huge fan, and so unfortunate that this is the topic that brings us together, but it also gives me hope that we are having this conversation. For context, for any of our viewers who may or may not be familiar with CAIR, we're the nation's largest American Muslim civil rights organization, and in that context, challenging Islam, and with that positioning, challenging Islamophobia is key to our work. It is the core of our work, and we see it in all that we take on, from the legislative policies that we put forward to the outreach and education we do in the community. And really, what hurts us the most, of course, is the civil rights violations that American Muslims complain of. We work on a variety of issues, ranging from individual hate crimes and hate incidents to, of course, law enforcement abuses and harassment, to immigration discrimination, and the list goes on. And what we see often, of course, is that there is a parallel, that when anti-Asian hate crimes go up, so do anti-Muslim hate crimes. When anti-Muslim hate crimes are going up, so are anti-Semitic hate crimes. And so we approach these issues understanding that they are interwoven, that hate and bigotry, unfortunately, harms all of us, but it also doesn't happen in a vacuum. One of the questions we asked a lot as an organization more than a decade ago was, we're now more than 10 years post 9/11, why is Islamophobia increasing? And in attempting to answer that question, we started to look at the funding mechanisms for Islamophobia. We went through, and if any of you really enjoy tax papers, like the most nerdy thing you could do is look at someone's 990s. And it's what we did. We did that with every Islamophobic organization we could find. If they were buying bus ads, we were looking at their 990s. If they were advocating for bans on Sharia, we were looking at their 990s. If they were harassing Muslim leaders, we were looking at their 990s. And what we saw over the course of several years was that hundreds of millions of dollars were being spent by these organizations to promote Islamophobia. It didn't stop there, though. Where's the money coming from? People asked. Hundreds of millions of dollars is no small feat. We saw, of course, numerous individual donors. We saw donors who we couldn't get a hold of. But what we learned that was incredibly disturbing, and I think goes to the point specifically about Islamophobia funding and the tie with pro-Israel groups, is how Jewish Communal Fund and Jewish Federation were funding these groups. That they were not just funding them, let's be clear, they were providing a cover for their donors to fund them. So when I give to a communal fund or a federation, I am giving and nobody knows that I gave. But when that communal fund and federation give to the Islamophobic organization, we can find that. And so what that does is, if Zahro Billoo sitting in Los Angeles wants to give $10,000 or $20,000 or $50,000 to the likes of who we've mentioned, Stephen Emerson, Daniel Pipes, Pamela Geller, and others, I can do so under the cover of the fund. This is a problem. It makes it easier to give money to Islamophobic organizations. So it's not just that the money is going, it's that it's making it easier to give it. It's also giving them the credibility of receiving funding from some of the largest institutions in the Jewish community, who say that they don't intend to fund hate, but continue to do so. And we've seen some progress here over the years. I believe Canary Mission is now no longer receiving funding from some of the funders. But even as recently as 2019 and 2020, if you look at the 990s, Daniel Pipes, Steve Emerson, and the likes are receiving this funding from the community. They're pro-Israel groups. And this is also where it's important that we get really clear, is that Stephen Emerson, Daniel Pipes, etc., have aligned themselves with anti-Semites when it is convenient, right? Donald Trump, John Hagee, others are favored by some of these individuals. But the line is Israel. And it doesn't just impact the narrative, right? The question is, okay, so then what are these groups doing? You've talked about individual crimes and individual harm, but what are these groups doing? Just as recently as December, we saw that inside CAIR, one of our directors had been co-opted by Stephen Emerson to spy on the Muslim community. So when we're talking about pro-Israel funding and the way it promotes Islamophobia, that's the impact. Spying and surveillance on Muslim civic organizations. Another spy came forward and said that over the course of several years, he'd received upwards of $100,000 to spy on the Muslim community in the DC, Virginia area. That money came from Stephen Emerson and his organization. And so to really get to the core of the issue, we have to start to pull this apart. We have to start to say, look, like, we need to fight anti-Semitism and we need to fight Islamophobia. But we have to have honest conversations about how pro-Israel or anti-Palestinian voices are hampering our ability to have this conversation, to do this work, and are attempting to censor those who want to have honest conversations about it. Because to Donna's point about liberal Islamophobia, one of the things that always strikes me about liberal Islamophobia is that the way the double standards manifest. Really resonant for what we're looking at this week, of course, around double standards is how white presenting Ukrainian refugees are being treated versus how Black Ukrainian refugees are being treated, or frankly, how the Palestinian resistance movement is treated as compared to how the Ukrainian resistance movement is treated. And so to get to the core of the issue, we have to start to call apart or pull apart the double standards and the hypocrisy. To say, wait, we're on the same side of these issues. We care about everyone's safety and ability to practice their religion and enjoy the freedoms that they are promised and so on. But it cannot be that on one end, you're telling me you want to fight Islamophobia, or these organizations are telling me they want to fight Islamophobia while funding Islamophobic groups. They want to fight Islamophobia while promoting Islamophobic smears against Muslim leaders, that they want to fight Islamophobia while partnering with law enforcement, engaging in their own surveillance and celebrating those who engage in surveillance. And the list goes on. But the double standard, I think, is really at the core of the conversation. For us to fight anti-Semitism and Islamophobia effectively, we have to think about who is really working on these issues and who is causing further harm to the communities in the process.
Thank you, Zahra. Appreciate that, discussion, that panel presentation of yours. What I'm going to do now is give my talk. And before I do, I just want to make clear that none of the speakers here are speaking officially on behalf of any organization that they represent or that they work for. These are personal views that are being expressed. So I would like to follow up on what has been raised here before about CAIR's work on Islamophobia and the latest report that they put out on funding of Islamophobia by the 50 largest foundations in the United States, focusing specifically on 35 of them. From the period of 2017 to 2019, $105 million, $105 million were given by these foundations to organizations, nonprofits that promote hate speech and Islamophobia. And what I especially wanted to focus on is the donors from the Jewish community who are these donors are very wealthy, billionaires, many of them, and are pro-Israel and right-wing in their politics. And they are the ones who are providing a huge percentage of that 105 million. In fact, they're giving $30 million of that 105 million. If you remember that Jews are 2 to 3% of the American population, think about $30 million of that being money from pro-Israel Jewish foundations going to promote Islamophobia. And some of the names that have been mentioned or have not been mentioned, Irving Moskowitz, who started his bingo empire in Southern California, $1 million. Bernie Marcus, the founder of Home Depot, His foundation gave nearly $6 million for Islamophobic organizations. And the Jewish Communal Fund that several people, including Donna, have spoken of, has given $3 million over that 2-year period. Sheldon Adelson, of course, everybody knows him, and he gave $4 million. And the organizations to which they're giving funds, I'm going to mention them briefly, they received 20% of all the money given, that 105 million. 20% of that, $20 million roughly, was going to these Islamophobic organizations founded by right-wing pro-Israel Jews. We've talked about Daniel Pipes and Middle East Forum. They received $2 million. CAIR, I think somebody might have mentioned CAIR, the media pressure group that lobbies for pro-Israel media and criticizes pro-Palestinian reporting, received $4 million, and David Horowitz's group mentioned already $3 million. So these groups serve as the vanguard for the Israel lobby, which includes groups like the American Jewish Committee, which we've mentioned, the ADL, AIPAC, etc. The big organizations like the ones I mentioned are the sort of the good cop here. And these sort of really far right-wing groups that we mentioned are the bad cop. They're the ones who do the dirty work. They're the ones who smear people. And then the larger, sort of more polite organizations can come along and say, we're the good Jews. The bad Jews you don't have to listen to too much, but they do exploit and employ a lot of the content that's dug up by the right-wing smear groups. And I wanted to talk now about normalization. We know what that means in the context of Israel, normalizing quote-unquote relations with some Arab states and the Abraham Accords. We know about how Israel attempts to co-opt Palestinian voices, Israeli Palestinian voices, and Arab voices, and tries to recruit the good Muslims to speak on behalf of Israel or to defend Israel, even though they're a small minority, but they are amplified and given a large voice. But I wanted to talk about normalization as it happens, and this was the topic that Zahro spoke about at the American Muslims for Palestine. Her talk was criticized in the pro-Israel Jewish media, and I want to talk about that a little bit as well. But there are examples of how the Israel lobby is attempting to co-opt American Muslims. And we have the AJC, the American Jewish Committee's Muslim Jewish Advisory Group, which was founded actually in a partnership with the Islamic North America Association. Somebody will correct me if I got that wrong. An actually major, large Islamic group in the United States is partnering with the AJC. And it has to be noted that they do not deal, they deal mostly with anti-Semitism. They may claim they deal with Islamophobia, but that's not the purpose for which they were created. And they don't deal with Israel, and they don't deal with foreign policy. They don't deal with Israel-Palestine, I should say. They only deal with domestic issues, because on domestic issues, Muslims and Jews can easily sort of have a common agenda. But the really hard issues that deal with foreign policy and Israel-Palestine, they don't touch with a 10-foot pole. One other project I wanted to mention that also is co-optation by an Israeli group called the Shalom Hartman Institute is the Muslim Leadership Institute, which has brought a cohort of young Muslim American leaders to Israel. That project is headed on the Israeli end by a former JDL leader, Yossi Klein Halevi, who's sort of whitewashed his former career and now become an author, and wrote a book about his, my Muslim friend or something along those lines. He runs the Israel side of that project, and an imam from Duke University chaplain named Abdullah Antepli, a Gulenist Muslim chaplain, runs the Muslim and recruits the Muslim leaders to go. They're sent on an all expenses paid trip to Israel. They take courses led by rabbis on Zionism, on Israeli history, on Jewish history. It's an attempt really to educate Muslims about issues like the ones that I just mentioned. This group does not exist in order to explain Islam to Jews, in order to send the Muslims out to the Jewish community, or send Muslims to the Jewish community to try to build these bridges. Really, what it's designed to do is to diminish the intensity of the emotions that Muslims and Arabs have towards Israel, and to diminish the intensity of the uh, hostility that's engendered by Israeli policies among Arabs and Muslims. So in Zahra's speech, she talked about how these groups doing this are not friends of American Muslims. And for that, she was attacked by the Jewish pro-Israel media, saying that this is anti-Semitic. This is a completely wrong notion, because Zahra was not talking about Jews. She was talking about Israel lobby groups who, for political purposes, are attempting to make inroads into the American Muslim community. This has nothing to do with religion. It has nothing to do with Jews per se. It only has to do with a small slice of the leadership of the American Jewish community, which is much more right-wing than the mainstream, than the overall masses of Jews in the United States. And she's calling out something that legitimately needs to be called out, not just by Muslims, but also by American Jews. And that's really one of the main things that I think Donna and I and a number of our colleagues are doing. I want to also mention that I find the attacks on Zahra and on Linda Sarsour, another major national Muslim leader, to be misogynist, because they tend to pick the figures in the community that they think are the most vulnerable to attack. And they go after them and they hold them up as examples of the bad Muslim, the ones that we can really sort of point at and tell the world, these are the bad Muslims, the ones you need to stay away from, the ones whose speeches and whose rhetoric is anti-Semitic or hostile to Israel. If you look at all of the speeches that given at the AMP conference that Zahra spoke at, the male speakers said virtually the same thing. They may have spoken about different subjects, but they generally repeated the overall sort of thrust of what she was saying. Nobody talked about any of them, the male speakers. So I think that there's not just a political animus here, but there's also an element of misogyny. I also wanted to now talk a little bit about what's the connection between the Israel lobby here in the United States and Israel itself. As Hatem mentioned, Islamophobia has a long history in Israel itself. It's related to the fact that most Palestinians are Muslim, that Al-Aqsa Mosque and the Haram al-Sharif are located, of course, in East Jerusalem. Islam itself focuses a great deal of its attention and its religious worship on those sites. And then Israeli right-wing Israelis, those who are religious in their orientation, many of them see this as a battle between Jews and Muslims, a kind of end times battle, Armageddon type battle as to who will win. And these far right Israeli Orthodox figures basically envision Haram al-Sharif being destroyed and being replaced by the Third Temple. So Israel itself sees itself as sort of the bastion of Western opposition to Islam. And it makes alliances with all of the Euro-right governments, like in Hungary and Poland, which have as major part of their political agenda, hatred, not just of Islam, but hatred in particular of Muslim refugees from Syria and places like that, who they've put up walls and fences to try to keep out, and attack Muslims who are already in Europe and talk about them as, the fifth column within our society, attempting to undermine our Western Christian values, et cetera, et cetera. So Israel and figures like Bibi Netanyahu and the Likud party have made it a point to create alliances with these movements and parties in Europe to try to create the impression that there's a global alliance. Israel has to do that because it's losing the support of the liberal democratic societies and liberal democratic movements throughout the world, including losing the support of many American Jews, by the way, which is important. And so it has to find a replacement for that. And the way that it does that is now turning to Islamophobia, now turning to Christian evangelical groups who are taking the place of American Jews here. So there's this insidious process that goes on. And I want to also mention that what's going on in Israel affects the Israel lobby itself, because the Israel lobby, the groups I mentioned, take their lead from Israel. Marching orders, they take marching orders in terms of legislation in Congress that's pro-Israel, and they're also affected by the agenda that's set by the Israeli government and by the Israeli political parties as to what types of activities they should be doing here in the United States. BDS is a perfect example, the boycott, divestment, sanctions movement, which was founded by the Palestinians, by, in fact, an Israeli Palestinian, Omar Barghouti. And in the United States now, we have the Israel lobby pressuring state houses and the federal government to enact anti-BDS laws that would penalize, criminalize, economically impact anyone who expresses support for BDS in the United States. No matter that this is a flagrant violation of free speech and the First Amendment, which all the courts that have ruled on this issue have agreed with that perspective. It's an example because Israel itself sees BDS as an existential threat, even though it's a nonviolent organization, a nonviolent movement. It sees the demand for return of Palestinian refugees, the demand for equal rights for Palestinian citizens of Israel and along with Jewish citizens of Israel. It sees that as a fundamental threat to the Jewish state, which I call a Judeo-supremacist state, because the rights of Jews are protected and enshrined in the national institutions. The rights of Palestinians are secondary and have even been diminished further by the nation state law and things like that. So that's basically what I have to say. And now I want to just ask the four panelists whether there were any comments that they heard amongst the other speakers or questions that they might have, or any points that come to mind that they didn't make in their earlier presentation.
Well, if I'm gonna add specifically about the strategy of contesting Muslim presence in civil society, because I think this is very, very critical and important. Daniel Pipes, in a speech that he gave post 9/11, he said he worries from the Jewish point of view. Again, he's confusing Jewish with Israeli point of view, but we'll give him this pass, of the increasing stature, affluence, and enfranchisement of American Muslims. And therefore, part of the strategy is to actually push Muslims out of civil society. And the mechanism by doing so is by labeling and creating as much demonization of the Muslim subject by using the charge of anti-Semitism, one, terrorism, or trying to make link to Hamas. Therefore, if you actually look at every Muslim leader of repute in this country, you would see that Daniel Pipes, on the one hand, Stephen Emerson, ADL, and other of these Islamophobic fronts have created a dossier, a footprint on the web in such a way that if Zahra is invited to speak or to be on a panel, that these Islamophobic agencies, including the mainstream, ADL, AGC, and others, they go into overdrive with letters to civil society leadership. And as we know, civil society leadership are too concerned of their own upward mobility. So it might as well throw Zahra off the board, throw this off the board, and just not rock the boat. Therefore, if we think about this notion that AGC or others are fighting Islamophobia, I want to see the evidence. They attacked Keith Ellison when he was running for the Democratic Party chairship and levied at him a type of attack that at the moment where Trump got elected, I would have expected ADL, AGC, and others to say, yes, we have differences with you on Israel, but I think this is the moment where we need actually to uplift the Muslim community by actually supporting the chairmanship of Keith Ellison. But contrary to this, they used Islamophobia and attack him. Think of the attacks on Ilhan Omar, because she had the temerity to say that PDS is unacceptable and a way for people to engage. She has constantly been under attack. And in this past election, AIPAC and the Majority for Israel on the Democratic Party, which is unheard of, mobilized massive resources to try to defeat her. And they continue, never miss an opportunity to be more Islamophobic than the Islamophobic figures. Think of Rashida Tlaib and the constant attack that is mounted, Linda Sarsour. So if you think about both the women, and also we could speak some of the men Palestinians, but we'll set it aside, that's where contesting Muslim presence in civil society, especially speaking Muslim, they would be actually very happy if a silent Muslim that will sit in the background that will looks good on an advertisement, like an advertisement board. So they're okay with unspeaking, unengaged, uncritically involved Muslim. That's what the type that Shalom Hartman Institute wants, the AGC ISNA joint board. And as such, what our effort should be is to insist on Muslims being at the center of the discourse in civil society when it comes to issues of Islam, Islamophobia, and the Muslim representation. And more importantly, you have to hear our voices and don't expect us to be your therapist for your discomfort. Those days are long gone of expecting those who are receiving Islamophobia, demonization, to actually cater to your feelings of actually listening and hearing the truth about Palestine, but more importantly about Islamophobia and the culpability and responsibility of such organizations in fomenting and mainstreaming Islamophobia in this country.
Thank you, Hatem. Any other of our panelists have any comments or want to say anything? Well, I just want to follow up a little bit on what Hatem said about what's called the Squad, the Progressive Caucus within the Democratic Party in Congress. There is a Progressive Caucus that's less left-wing than the 7 or 8 members, but I think that we can talk about the attacks on the 3 Muslim Americans, and also Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez as well. A is being really fueled by misogyny, and B certainly being fueled by Islamophobia, taking statements that they make out of context, trying to smear them, and Ilhan Omar in particular, because she originally was born in Somalia, Trump talking about her going back where she came from if she doesn't like America, and pictures of 9/11 smoke rising from the World Trade Center with her picture smeared in the front. There is this insidious campaign by Islamophobes, by a lot of the pro-Israel groups targeting these people and trying to turn them into persona non grata. And I might mention that almost all of these candidates, all of these people, once they're elected to Congress, have Democratic primary candidates who are put forward by donors to AIPAC, to the Israel lobby organizations, who are funding the good Muslim or the good African American candidate, who they had that against Ilhan Omar, they did that, and Rashida Tlaib. Every election, they're going to have a candidate trying to make inroads and beat them, so that they can have the good, acceptable Muslim or African American serving in Congress, the one that doesn't rock the boat, the one that doesn't make Palestine a top priority. So this has a very strong political dimension. And I want to make clear that the attempt to turn this into a religious war or create the religious divisions is a key element of what they're doing. They're trying to turn this into a Jew against Muslim sort of battle, and it doesn't have anything. It doesn't have much, if anything, to do with religion. And in terms of religion, there are many ways in which we can find common ground. It's really an issue of politics and power. Israeli power, Israeli control of Palestinians, Israeli apartheid, and the impact that it's having. And we need to keep the eye on politics and not allow them to talk about anti-Semitism and talk about religious hatred and all these other red herring arguments that they attempt to insert.
Well, building on something that Hatem was saying too, and you were saying you wanted to end on a positive note, I do think it's so genuine and true that the organizing going on now across our communities is just so powerful. And I think that, you know, we can't underestimate that. I mean, from the work that the Movement for Black Lives and so many groups are doing in terms of like really challenging anti-Black racism, Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, and so many other forms of injustice, both locally, nationally, and globally. We're really seeing our cross-fertilization and also recognizing both the similarities in our struggles and also, but the differences in very important ways in how we can really stand together. I just think it's, you know, I'm living in South Florida now, and people often think like, you know, Florida, it's only like horrible things that happen. We do have horrible things that happen here. However, the social justice organizing in communities, we're part of a, you know, we've created a coalition for justice in Palestine with so many of our groups, Palestinian groups, Muslim groups, Deen defenders, JVP, and we're all working to CAIR, and we're working together in so many powerful ways. And I just think we don't want to lose that as well when we tell the story, because that's a really important part of our story. And it's happening right now.
Thank you, Donna. I think that that Zahro has to leave at 3 o'clock. In a few minutes, so I want to ask her if she has any final comments to make, but also to thank her for being on the panel and thank her for her work, and thank you, unfortunately, for being a lightning rod. A little bit. All of us, I think, are lightning rods in one way or another among our communities.
We call it good trouble. Silence Silence never changed history. Have you ever read a book about a person been silent for 60 years?
Yeah.
Didn't say anything? All of our tradition begins with the spoken word.
Yeah.
So don't underestimate the word.
So 2 things before I have to jump. One, just, you know, gratitude again for this conversation. The first is something, Richard, that I didn't mention, but you did, and so I appreciated it, and I'll raise it again, which is what one of my colleagues, Halima Barucha, calls gendered Islamophobia. And so the way in which women experience Islamophobia differently. And, you know, in some cases we're talking about it's easier to identify a Muslim woman to target her because she's wearing a headscarf. She's seen as oppressed rather than as a terrorist, which is how Muslim men are seen. But then there's also this, you know, very nefarious way in which women leaders are targeted and attempted to be censored. I was on the panel, the controversial panel, with 2 other men. One of them being much more my senior in the organization, Nihad Awad, our founder, and another leader, both Palestinian, and both of who said essentially the same things I was saying. and yet with, minimal smear and targeting as compared. And so it, raising up for this audience, it struck me how many people talk to me about my need for physical security planning in the month after the AMP convention, right? Just like, do you have cameras? Do you have a safety plan? Are you do you have security on payroll? And it was just, it makes it's just a different dynamic that women are experiencing. And you highlighted this also, is that Ilhan Omar and Rashida Tlaib are targeted far more than Andre Carson is, arguably because their positions on Palestine are far more progressive than his are. But when they all support the same legislation, they are called out differently. And then the other thing is, Donna, I really appreciate the mention of drop the ADL.org, right? It's drop ADL or drop the ADL? Drop the
ADL. It's drop the ADL.
Okay, there is okay. So drop the ADL.org. I remember when I started in this work close to 20 years ago now, and more than a decade at CAIR, ADL often feels like an organization that we are not permitted to critique because it has done some good work, because it is seen as the leading voice on civil rights and hate crimes and cultural competency and tech security and all of these things. But for every good action, they have so often, for decades now, targeted progressive activists, civil rights activists, spied on them at the behest of local law enforcement, and sold that information to international governments. And even in recent years, continue to target Muslim organizations and leaders unapologetically. They still to this day maintain their dossiers on Arab and Muslim organizations on their website in an attempt to censor them. And so progress for me has been to see the movement around droptheadl.org. I really appreciated that the first ask for me to review that letter did not come from an Arab or Muslim organization. Instead, it was our peers in this work, our partners in interfaith civil rights and social justice work, who said enough is enough. And if you look at the signatory list, it's so diverse. It reflects the beauty of the movements that people have been cultivating for years. And so that's such a concrete, positive development to be able to say, wait a second, right? Like, you cannot say that you are our partner and at the same time be harming our communities. We are moving forward going to call that out and will no longer tolerate it. So much work to be done, but also incredible milestones being reached.
Thank you. Thank you both to Donna and Zahro for ending on a positive note. There's a lot of bad news that we always talk about, but it's good to talk about.
There's a question in the chat from Shazia, and I think it's a good question about how that Islamophobic organizations in the US are now exporting a different type of interfaith relations with United Arab Emirates and Israel relations. And I think it's very important as we see the whole Abrahamic Accords internationally that brought in a number of normalizations, that within that also there's a whole program that is using Islamophobia and demonization of Muslim and Islam as it relates to the political aspect, meaning that this whole attack or attempt to criminalize Muslim political activism in the US, in Europe, as well as in the Muslim world. And that relationship between some of the Islamophobic organizations here in this country, in particular, Middle East Forum with Daniel Pipes, who has become a go-to expert in the United Arab Emirates, where he goes to try to provide training on how to deal with Islamists, and also reflecting some of the Islamophobia in Europe, where not only United Arab Emirates, but Egypt and others are demonizing Muslim involvement in civil society and trying to counsel Europeans under the rubric that anyone that is engaging politically is basically a front for the Muslim Brotherhood movement. So that's the area where we say Muslim Islamophobia. It is actually being in partnership with the Islamophobic organizations here that have a pro-Israel window toward their work. And as such, I agree with Shazia that these form of interfaith, I don't call them interfaith, I call them imperial faith relations that are really positing religion as an imperial force. So I think we need to speak of imperial religion that's always been an instrument of power, where you think of Moses, Muhammad, and Jesus as being the salesman for the military-industrial complex, and you would think an advertisement for that God is on your side if you're able to bomb with an F-16. That's an imperial religion versus the liberatory religion of that takes people and lift them up. That is not the discussion in here. So I think we need to be aware of this importation externally and bring it internally, as well as internally exported externally, of interfaith being used as an instrument of further demonizing Muslim and Islam on the political dimension of it. And I agree that the relations between United Arab Emirates and Israel is being instrumentalized in that direction.
I wanted to also add that in the grift, I call it the grift of Daniel Pipes and Middle East Forum, he looks for well-connected, deep pocket anti-Muslim groups and countries like the United Arab Emirates and also India. It's sort of Hindutva kind of movement in India, anti-Muslim movement. He's going where the money is. Lots of money among American Hindus, and also the United Arab Emirates showers millions of dollars on lobby groups in the United States, and he gets a share of that. So there's a financial incentive for a lot of these organizations to take the political, not just the pro-Israel political views that they do, but sort of demonizing Muslims, because that sort of gives them a reason to exist. Hatem, do we have any other questions that Hani can bring up?
I did not see any. I'm looking, and that's the only question that is coming on the channels.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah.
Donna, do you want to have anything that you haven't said already that you want to bring up?
No, I appreciated being on the panel. Hatem, we used in our Jews Against Anti-Muslim Racism curriculum. Your work is always very important. And I also did want to encourage people, if you haven't already, to read the primer. That's at droptheadl.org. It lays it out in exquisite detail. Many of our groups came together over a long period of time to put together. It's a very evidence-based, and you also see the long history. This isn't something that just happened recently. It's rooted in ADL's history. And so, yes, I urge people to read it and to contact us if you would like to, learn more or join the efforts and join the over 200 organizations who've already signed on to the pledge.
I wanted to follow up a little bit on what Hatem was talking about, United Arab Emirates and the Abraham Accords. I think here again is another example of where Israel has succeeded in dividing the Muslim community. There are already splits between Sunni and Shia, in the Middle East and maybe around the world. But the fight against Iran has brought together Israel with these Sunni Gulf states and the most of the ones that have joined the Abraham Accords. And also it has defanged opposition to Israeli policies, and it's defanged the overwhelming consensus that had previously existed in favor of Palestine and Palestinian rights. So even though you have a natural affinity between Muslims in the Middle East and Palestine because of the Haram al-Sharif, because of the religious connections, which also engendered support for Palestinian political rights, the Israelis have been able to sort of divide and conquer in the Arab world, because you have this split happening, and Iran is seen as the sort of bête noire of the Muslim world. And Israel has been able to really take advantage of that. And the alliance between Israel and these Gulf states, the Sunni states, is really skin deep. There is no natural affinity there. There is no political affinity, except if you want to talk about all of them being sort of authoritarian countries and countries that are heavily steeped in sort of extreme religious views. of their particular, religious denominations. So the Abraham Accords are something that is only a temporary thing that's brought together because of hostility towards Iran. And if we come to the point, which I hope we will, where Iran is actually brought into the region itself and into the global community, Israel is going to be left out in the cold, and all of that sort of common interest that they now find is going to go away.
I began my talk about the shifts of the Cold War. In the Cold War, you have two superpowers, and therefore you have utilitarian states that function between the Soviet Union alliance and the United States. After the end of the Cold War, you have only one major superpower, the United States. And therefore, states that had utilitarian function in the Cold War needed to recast themselves with a new role. And Israel have been able to cast its role as being the frontline state in fighting against so-called Islamism or the Muslim menace and Muslim threat, which immediately corresponds to the clash of civilization thesis of Huntington and all of the discourse that many of those who sharpened their teeth on militarism of the Cold War retooled themselves and tried to peddle their strategic importance in a unipolar world where the United States. So Israel, in that sense, have been able successfully, we could critique it, but successfully have been able to recast itself as the critical ally of the United States and the West in fighting against the green menace, Islam and Muslims. And in such a way, it could domestically in the United States, our police departments send their officers to be trained in Israel in countering terrorism, even though that Israel commits terrorism against the Palestinians, but that's a side issue. The whole Pegasus and surveillance technology, artificial intelligence, all this is an outcome of a unipolar world and the strategic positioning that has taken place since the 1990s up to this point in this sense. And I think what we need is to begin to critique not only the particular way of Islamophobia, but also how Israel in this current environment with its alliance here with the United States as the major superpower is really feeding off on the conflicts in the region because there's many opportunities to be had. And the more intensification of regional conflicts, the more Israel's role as so-called bastion of stability as an alliance for the United States gets to have a new lease on life. And I think that's where we have to have a critique, not only of the specific Islamophobia, but the global dimension of it in this current unipolar world of the United States that gives a lease for military-industrial complex, massive military expenditure, securitization of every element of our society. You walk to 7-Eleven and your pictures are taken 24 times just to buy a big gulp. I don't buy it, but in general, this whole infrastructure is predicated on that we have an international threat of terrorism that have been cast on the Muslim subject, even though domestically the FBI says that the primary domestic threat comes from white supremacists, but that gets a pass because again, if you're white, you're right in the terms of framing. So in essence, there was no attention paid to the rising tide of white supremacists who are both Islamophobic and anti-Semitic. But in essence, they get no attention to speak of.
I wanted to just parenthetically talk about the repositioning between the Cold War and Islamophobia. A really interesting footnote here is Daniel Pipes in 1990 took on this role of the leading pro-Israel Islamophobe and founded Middle East Forum. But Daniel Pipes' father was Richard Pipes, who was one of the founders of neoconservatism, but also one of the greatest hawks, Cold War anti-communist hawks, and sort of the one of the leading intellectual figures in that movement. And I think he was also an official in the Reagan administration, if I've got that right. So you see it in the one family, one right-wing family, of the transition from being an anti-communist and seeing that as the bête noire for to unify America, and this transitioning to this fertile field of Islamophobia in the career of Daniel Pipes.
Yeah. And I don't leave the Muslim world, what you call, unattended to. They're all Saudi Arabia, they're all United Arab Emirates, Egypt. So in here, we have many alliances, and in essence, crafting Islamophobic threat and Islamophobic demonization becomes a way to give a new lease on life to the current political dynamic, whether it's in the military form or globalization, pernicious capitalism, expansion into all types of markets. So it has a very, very utilitarian function. Huntington in page 20, he literally says we need to find an enemy in order for us to achieve self-love, which means that we craft our own society by identifying the enemy in order for us to get a false sense of patriotism and false sense of unity domestically. And I think in this sense, the object of hate is the Muslim world that presents the possibility of achieving some type of fictitious unity that is rotating around the identity of white supremacy as the basis of what is the identity in the West. And this is get clash of civilization, replacement theory. All this is part of, these theories. I call them science fiction and junk science, but nevertheless, many people have adopted it, and that's what you get almost on a daily basis.
Well, I think since Hatem, I believe, has to teach a class,
Yes.
I don't know if Donna has anything, final words that she wants to add. I don't want to put you on the spot if you don't. I'll just thank everybody on the panel, and especially all the people in the audience who joined us. I hope you found it interesting. I know we did, and thanks for being here. And we'll try to do something on similar subjects in the future. So thanks again, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.